right, some good questions from David Johnson, like our top 3 privacy and security things we wish that we had done differently. Data as the new oil versus the new gold, and privacy as a human right. Android hardening advice and the value of encrypted calendars, potentially they're useless, question mark, I think is kind of the question that we got there. Welcome to the Surveillance Support 231 Q&A, where we like to answer questions from all of you guys who make this podcast possible. These come from patrons who are consistently contributing to the podcast, as well as sometimes people on xmrchat.com, and we haven't been getting as many over there. So if you like Monero and you want to tip us Monero and ask us a question one time, it's a great way to do so. So check us out via either avenue down in the description. And now we're going to go into David Johnson's question. What top 3 privacy and security enhancing / degrading practices do you wish you did or correspondingly did not embrace earlier in your life on with hindsight? I'm going to reword that. What 3 things would we have changed in our privacy journey? One of them that I'm very conflicted on, and I'm sure Nate might feel similarly about this, I'm still very polarized on this, is showing my face. As a content creator, I didn't think much about it, to be honest. I just kind of did it. I showed my face before it was like exclusively a super, privacy-oriented channel on my end. And so it's not something I put much thought into. With that said, looking back on it, the channel just wouldn't be what it is without my face and having a person behind it. And I think it would be a lot less personal and it wouldn't carry the same message. So that's one thing that I wish I just made a conscious decision about, if that makes sense. And I might have come to the same decision, but it was never really well thought out. So that's number 1 for me. Number 2,
I know it's like hard to come up with 3 on the spot, right?
Yeah, we do these on the spot, so we don't do that much prep. I will say a reason why this is hard is it is about kind of the perspective you have about your mistakes, because most mistakes you're going to make, even in life in general, aren't like devastating. They're not going to like dramatically impact the rest of your life. And as long as you see those as things that you're learning and that are going to update your future, it's a good perspective to have. And it's why it's hard for me to find things I would have changed, because a lot of mistakes I made were not long-term mistakes and things that I learned from, and now I know better. For all of you out there, definitely try to see those mistakes as long-term wins.
While you're thinking of number 2, because I'm in the same boat, one thing came to mind and I'm not sure about number 2 and 3. So while you're thinking, I'll share my thing that came to mind is I wish I had done things sooner, in the sense that I have this famous story. So when I moved into my current place, the ISP is included with our housing. One of the things the ISP does is they don't allow port forwarding. So I can't put any of my usual like Nextcloud or Jellyfin. If I self-host them in the house instead of a VPS, I can't send them out to the wider internet directly the way I used to. So I had to start looking into other alternatives, and people very quickly recommended Cloudflare Tunnel. And for the longest time, I put it off because I was like, in my experience, anytime I do something new, it takes at least half a day because I have to like figure it out, tinker with it, break something, redo it, start over, blah, blah, blah. So I put it off forever. And then when I finally sat down to do it, it was literally like, oh, copy and paste this command on your server and then run it with this command. And it was literally like 5 minutes. That's all I had to do. And I was like, oh my God, I could have done this 3 weeks ago. And I mean, that one's a little different because I was like trying to make sure I had the time to like break it and redo it. But just so many things that like I put off because I'm like, oh, this is going to be hard. This is going to take a lot of work. And a lot of the time it turns out to be easier than expected. Or alternately, I start doing it and I find those things sooner that like, okay, next time I do it, I want to do this differently. And I think that's one thing for sure that I wish I'd done different.
I came up with one, potentially a hot take. I'm going to approach it very carefully here because it's not a full negative. I wish that I embraced a middle ground sooner with my privacy journey. Where I'm going with this is I think that I was in the very intense inconveniencing my life way too much period for a lot longer than I needed to be in, like years. And I feel like during that time period, there was more sacrifices made than I realized at the time, if that makes sense. And that, looking back on it now, I think actually paused a lot of things. Like I think in some ways, like I had less time to work on Techlore. I had less time to like be with other people. And there was just a lot of things I sacrificed for that. And for what benefit at the end of the day, it's like not a huge benefit from what I can tell. And so I kind of wish I embraced more of the middle ground and found what my middle ground was. But without going to that extreme, I also wouldn't know what the middle ground is. And so what I've been trying to communicate with people recently is like, hey, it's okay to go maybe too far, like figure out what the limit is, do it, but be ready to quickly like understand why it's the limit and then find yourself the proper middle ground.
Just to add on to what you were saying is sometimes you do something that seems extreme and you realize like, oh, for you at least, like maybe not for everybody, but like, oh, for me, this is fine. Like I see a lot of discussion online where people argue over like custom phone OSs and they're like, oh, not everybody can run Graphene and Calyx because like certain apps don't work and blah, blah, blah. And that's totally true. But for me, it has been almost no disruption to my life whatsoever. Once every 6 months, there's like, oh, this app won't work or like I can't do this thing. And then I find a workaround and I move on because it's like a one-time situation and it's really not a big deal. So yeah, like sometimes going to that extreme, like I'd say 90% of the time you're going to be like, okay, that was too far. Let me pull back a little bit. But also there's that 10% of the time that you're going to be like, oh, this is fine. I can roll with this. This is no big deal. But I do agree with Henry. Like that's something that I preach too is like, if you do too much, you can always go back. Like if you delete Discord or Facebook and you're like, oh, actually, I got a lot of value out of that. You can sign right back up. They will take you back. There's very few things in privacy that once you do it, it's just permanent and you can't go back. I'm sure there's some, but they're pretty rare.
I think that's all I'm going to be able to come up with on the spot. And I think there's enough to think about there.
It's a weird human psychological trick that when you put somebody on the spot, suddenly their mind blanks. David Johnson's next question says, if it is said that data is the new oil, why are we not seeing those with birthright to said data building artificial islands or stocking up on private jets? Do you think perhaps it might be more descriptive to class data as the new gold?
I think they are.
I think he's saying the fact that like birthright to the said data, like, you know, us, like the people who are making that data.
Oh, I see.
I think you're kind of splitting hairs, to be honest. I've actually seen data as the new oil is a really controversial take. And to be honest, I think it's nitpicky and stupid. But there's people who argue that data is the new oil isn't really a fair phrase because like, why is it? It's like oil has to be refined and it has like there's a finite amount of oil. And it's like, okay, but like data has to be refined and like there's finite use cases for it theoretically. Like the point of the phrase data is the new oil is because in the Industrial Revolution, oil suddenly became a valuable resource. And once that happened, anybody who stumbled upon oil suddenly became rich overnight. Gold has like always been there. Gold has always been something that has had value in society. And like, this is a whole different rabbit hole of like, what is value? What is a store of value? What is money? Oil is a really good example because up until recently, it didn't really have a high demand and a use case. Like I'm sure it was a thing that people found from time to time, but it was just kind of like, oh, there's oil there. Who cares? And then once we found a use for it, suddenly it was super valuable. And like, you can see that in the age of surveillance capitalism, for example. Shoshana Zuboff talks about how Google was collecting all the metadata from their searches and they were kind of sitting on it like, we don't really know what to do with this. And then somebody came along and was like, well, what if we feed it back into the algorithm and learn from the users and kind of tweak the results to what we know about them. And thus Google search became what it is today, or what it was up until recently when everybody universally agrees it's garbage now. I think new gold, I don't know. I don't think that's really any more fitting. I would say that's less fitting because of the reasons I explained. I don't know. I think the phrase holds up. I think that's kind of the extent of my thoughts.
I have no thoughts on this, actually.
Fair enough. I mean, it's a really philosophical question, but I think it's kind of splitting hairs. I think data is the new oil is a perfectly apt phrase, but I don't think it really matters either way.
The reason why I don't have thoughts is it's not something I know much about, and I literally just hear everybody claim everything is the new gold nowadays. I'm just like, you know what? I don't care. Like, if something becomes the new store of value, we're going to know, and we're all going to move to it. And the only people who are going to actually, like, take advantage of it are people who are already insanely wealthy, who are going to be in a position to take advantage of it. And I think people have this idea that it's ridiculous. I have no issue saying that. People have this idea that things like Bitcoin are going to, like, somehow redistribute wealth to different people. That's just not going to happen. Bitcoin doesn't solve the fundamental human problems of our economic system. Like, the whole reason people are getting rich off of Bitcoin is because they acquired a lot faster before everybody else did. Like, that's not a fair system where just because you got to something first, you get more resources than the next person who might even be contributing more to society than you are. When people say that privacy is a human right, what basic level of personal privacy do you think should be entitled to protection? And honestly, this is a cop-out answer. I think if we just ask this question more, that would be the win that we need to see. Because there isn't going to be something that we're going to agree upon, right? Like, what is a human right is largely debated between countries, between states. That's why we have a complex legal system. Like, that's really all this... That's all a legal system does. Is it helps disputes and it helps decide if something like invaded someone's rights or not. And that's why we have these systems set up. So all I'll say to that is I don't know, but I think if that question was asked a bit more, then we would get to at least a better answer than where we are right now.
I really agree, because I think human rights are, in a lot of ways, I think they're a lot more complicated than people realize, because things like food is a human right. Okay, so in a famine situation, let's remove like the cause of the famine. Maybe it's like government corruption, like in Ethiopia back in the 80s. In a famine situation, does your right to food give you the right to come and take my food? Assuming like I don't have excess, assuming I only have enough food that I need. You need food too. Are you supposed to come and take my food and now I don't get food? Like, human rights, I think, are a little bit more complicated.
Yeah, and like if something's a right, does that mean you get it for free? Like, if it's a right, shouldn't the government give food for free? Like, that's a whole different discussion.
And like you said, like what is a right is, first of all, kind of constantly evolving with society. Like I know some countries view the internet as a human right now because the world has become so digital. And other countries, like here in America, I think if you said that to most people, they would kind of laugh and be like, what are you talking about? Nobody owes you the internet. But even as they say with a smartphone in their pocket that they're using to pay with their tap to pay debit card. Anyways, I think the general rule of thumb is, there's the saying that like, your right to swing your fist ends where my nose begins, or something like that, which again is like a really catchy way of saying it. But like, where does that actually, like when you look at free speech, there's so much debate, especially when we talk about, I know I'm going to get really controversial here, but when people talk about like hate speech, for example, what counts as hate speech? Like there are certain things that we can universally agree that like that was probably over the line. That's probably not protected speech. But then there's other things that half of the people would argue like that's hate speech, that's inciting hateful behavior. Whereas the other half of the people would be like, well, they're not calling for violence or anything. Like there are gray areas. I think people much smarter than us have been debating this for decades and probably will continue to debate it. And I don't think we'll ever have a clear answer because like Henry said, like that's why we have a legal system is, and I've seen this firsthand. When you read the laws for anything, some of those laws you will read and you will be like, why is this a thing? Like, why has this come up? Why is this codified? Who ran into this issue? But if you work at the elections office, you'll be like, man, I run into that issue like once a month. Like this is surprisingly common. And then there were also times that people would call in and be like, oh, here's my situation. And it's like, wow, nobody could have predicted the situation. This really is like a 1 in a million. I'm not sure what to do here. That's where the courts come in, is there's so much gray area and nuance that like we need people to kind of handle those case by case situations where it's new territory or it's kind of something that nobody could have predicted. And now we need to parse out like, where does the nose end? Where does the air begin? Like I don't think there's any one way to say like, oh, here's the basic level that's universally applicable, especially from us. Like I said, I think off the top of my head, I think there's some, and again, like drilling into these would require like years of lawyers sitting down and thinking this stuff through. But I think a good starting point would be things like data sovereignty, like the right to be forgotten in the EU, I think would be a really good one nowadays. Things like having meaningful choice, not right now this, agree to the terms of service or go yourself. Like just the right to opt out of like being tracked literally everywhere all the time. I think a lot of it would just come down to control and choice. Like a lot of privacy in a perfect world from the legislative side of things, a lot of privacy as a human right would just come down to the ability to know how you're being tracked, the ability to opt out of it, the ability to have control over your data, whether that means taking your data to another service or requesting deletion of your data. I think at the most basic level, that would be a good place to start. But I think it very quickly would become nuanced and full of gray area, like a lot of things in life. Our next question comes from Ghost. This one I think is actually a couple weeks old. You sent it to us in DMs and I meant to include it and I'm so sorry. I completely forgot. And then you reposted it again on one of the Q&As. So thank you for doing that. That was my fault though. But this was right after we talked about Android 16 and how the Pixel device trees weren't released. You said, thank you for covering the recent news. Your coverage reflects a lot of what I've been reading about. You say privacy motivated folks have a few options. Stock Android has lots of privacy concerns. Stock iOS has similar privacy concerns and maintains the walled garden. Custom Android development, as you noted, has been dealt a rather large blow, and true Linux phones are just not usable for most folks. For those of us who want to take advantage of features like virtualized desktop, but are rightfully worried about giving up privacy and security to do it, what do you recommend? Is there a way to truly lock down stock Android without modifying the core firmware? I'm not sure what you mean by virtualized desktop. Maybe you're talking about how the Android phones, you can like plug them into a monitor?
I think so. Yeah. And then use them as your desktop. Yeah.
You say, is there a way to truly lock down stock Android without modifying the core firmware? I'm going to point you to the New Oil's website because I have a page that is just a list of settings changes I recommend for both iOS and Android, and they're separate, so you can skip past one to go to the other. Every time there's a new version of Android, and before my iPhone broke, iOS, so now I'm behind on iOS, but I go through every single setting and I look through like, okay, what's new? What's changed? What do I think people should turn off? What do I think is probably fine? I mean, is there a way to truly lock it down? Not without a lot of workarounds. Like there's always going to be an amount of telemetry, an amount of privacy that you're giving up. But I think for either device, iOS or Android, I think there's and also apps and social accounts, like there's a lot you can do just by going through and changing the settings. And then on top of it, you can add in third-party services. Like a lot of VPNs nowadays come with ad blockers built in. You could use things like AdGuard. There's definitely a lot of options out there. It'll never be perfect. It'll never be the same as using a custom OS. But I think you can do a pretty good amount just on stock if you have to.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, the only thing I'll say to this question is I'm just unhappy with the mobile space. You're right. There is no great solution. I feel like in a lot of ways we take Linux for granted for desktop because it kind of is in a lot of ways a very ideal solution, which has as a whole maintained a lot of compatibility, is very usable for what people expect from a desktop experience. And yeah, still has a long ways to go to fully catch up to others. But even then, like Mac OS is not, in my view, akin to Android and iOS on mobile. Because I think on Mac OS, you can actually pretty much disable almost all the telemetry that Apple does. You can completely avoid an Apple account. And all these third-party tools can pretty much make Mac OS insanely private, and you still have good security. So there's not even this like middle ground option that I'm trying to refer to on desktop, which is, I think, Mac OS.
Real quick, you can kind of do that on Android. Like on stock Android, you can continue without a Google account. It's not quite the same, but it's similar.
It's possible, right? Like, yeah, you can do that, but you're missing very critical functionality on Android, and there's still things that you can't really guarantee for on stock. You can try removing Google Play services altogether. It's not something even I would like fully pursue. So yeah, I don't know. I'm just personally unhappy with the mobile space right now. I think that it's not a great situation. And I do think that having a Linux phone option would be great for this space. And one that's more usable and would actually kind of normalize certain technologies that maybe we would see in iOS and Android as well. Because I want Linux phones to succeed. And anytime I've like gone at them and I'm like, no, this sucks, it's like terrible to use, it's still because like I want this to be usable someday.
Real quick on that note, after the last time we talked about Linux phones, I kind of like revisited some stuff just out of curiosity. And I noticed Ubuntu Touch specifically, I think it's called like UB ports now or something like that. Anyway, it'll show up if you search for Ubuntu Touch. I noticed weirdly, their most supported device, I think, is like the Volaphone or Voya, however that's pronounced, instead of the Pine. Like the Pine phone is still considered like in beta. The Volaphone is, I think it's still technically like not considered fully stable, but if you look at the number of like supported features, it's like it's not like 90%, then 95% there. I know when we talk about Linux phones, we tend to think of like, you know, Pine phone or Purism or something, but I just wanted to throw out there like it may be worth going to the OS websites or like doing some research if you're interested in supporting the Linux market and trying to find something that's maybe a little bit more daily. I'm not saying it is for sure, but like if I were going to go with something right now, I think I would probably try to get my hands on a Volaphone and put UB Touch on it, because that to me looks really promising. And I guess my point is like if we think outside the box, there might be some more options that might be a little more doable for people.
Okay, so the last question is from Arc. It's about private calendars, so things like Proton Calendar and Tuda, regarding the end-to-end encryption aspect. So they pretty much are saying they don't understand why these are necessary compared to something like email. Is the concern that a company like Google or some other untrustworthy party can just have access to all of your events and reminders stored in your calendar if it's not private and secure? And then they expand. In my case, I'm experimenting with moving away from Proton Calendar. Instead, they have a CalDAV server on their NAS, and then they use Tailscale to connect to that. Am I losing some significant privacy or security by going this route as opposed to sticking with something like Proton Calendar? Yeah, it's a good question. So stuff I've reflected on as well. The reason why end-to-end encryption is important for something like this is, yes, exactly what you were referring to. It's to restrict the amount of data that a company can get about you, and it's to guarantee that that data is yours. Some people might really not like this analogy. The way that I see end-to-end encryption is like as close to self-hosting as you can do through a provider, if that makes sense. It's pretty much saying like, no, this is your data. And I think a better example here isn't necessarily end-to-end encryption, but like zero knowledge encryption, if that makes sense. Because that's better referring to what's going on here, which is that it's only you that has knowledge of the data. The provider that's like actually hosting your data doesn't know anything about it. If law enforcement is like tapping them, then they can't see it. There are lots of legal situations, for example, where like the events that you're going to and the people that you're meeting with are actually very sensitive things that can't be leaked. And if that's in any way leaked or someone requests that data from a party, that could really jeopardize a lot of people. And so it is very important for certain individuals. Now, of course, this falls apart on its face a little bit when you start including, like, if you have Proton calendar, but you invite someone that doesn't even have Proton into the calendar, and then that's on their calendar as well, then yeah, it kind of violates the purpose to some extent. Kind of like when you use Proton Mail via email and you send it to someone that has Gmail and you don't use an encrypted email, then a copy of that email is in that person's Gmail as well. But again, I think the ideal use case is like you're part of a team or you're collaborating with some people and you guys have a higher threat model, and you need to make sure that your calendars and events stay with just you, and then you all join like a shared end-to-end encrypted calendar with Proton Calendar. I would also argue what you're doing accomplishes that as well. If you're hosting your own NAS with your own Nextcloud instance, and that's also being kept to a select few number of people, then yeah, it's still accomplishing the same thing, which is it's your data and no one else is really accessing that data. So I personally think that in a lot of ways they do accomplish the same thing. And end-to-end encryption makes a bit less sense when it's like in a self-hosted environment where you have access to all the data. It's still important for other reasons, because then like theoretically someone who hacks your Nextcloud instance still can't get access to the data because theoretically it's encrypted unless it's on a device where there's an encryption key stored. So there are some other considerations like that. But I think you're kind of on the right track of thinking about how critically important this is in some situations and how uncritically important it is in others.
I think as with almost anything we talk about, I think threat modeling is a really important consideration here. I think on the most basic, like universally applicable level, in the sense of like we think everyone should think about this, is the idea of just opting out of data mining. So if you switch from, for example, say like Google and Google Calendar or Apple, but you switch over to something like does StartMail have a calendar, I think? Or Fastmail, like one of those.
I don't think they do.
I want to say it's Fastmail. There's companies like that come with calendars. And these are companies that they're not encrypted, but they do promise like we will never mine your data. We'll never look at your stuff without a court order, but we respect your privacy. And that's why we charge money, because that's our business model. We're not selling ads. And I think, for example, if you were to switch to one of those services where like it's not encrypted, but there is a solid business model and they respect your privacy, I think that could be one way of solving that solution. And at that point, again, like the kind of universal, like almost everyone should care about this, is just finding a company that respects your privacy and isn't mining your data. And then the step above that is the whole idea of third parties can see your events. So pulling out a random idea here, let's say there's a protest in your area that happens to turn violent. And in your calendar, you have lunch with somebody a block away from that protest at the same time it's happening. I don't know if this is a thing. I'm kind of making up a scenario here. But let's say the police do kind of like a geofence warrant, and they say, anyone who was in that area at this time, if they can see your calendar, they could place you in that area and say, well, he was at lunch a block away. Maybe that was a lie. Maybe he was actually at the protest and that was just his like code word. Again, I'm making up a scenario here, but my point is like, that's kind of the next level of concern, is like somebody actually looking at it with some kind of malicious intent. I think some other considerations would be things like ease of use. Nobody in my family is ever going to self-host Nextcloud, and they're goddamn sure never going to set up Tailscale. We use Tailscale here for Henry and I to like trade files for surveillance support. Even for me, it's a little bit complicated to set up. So not everybody has that kind of resource. Not everybody can afford a NAS. I think there is that consideration. If all that's in your calendar is just really mundane stuff like, hey, I got to do the laundry on Friday, I got to remember to call my grandma, those things are probably not a big deal. But things that are a little bit more sensitive, I think your setup works perfectly fine. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. Like Henry said, I think you kind of really hit the nail on the head. I think things like Proton and Tuda are making it easy enough that, especially because we encourage people to consider using those services in the first place, you may as well take advantage of the calendar while you're there. But I think there are perfectly legitimate reasons to not use it, especially if you can self-host it yourself, especially if you have concerns about like putting all your eggs in one basket.
With that said, we're going to go ahead and wrap things up. So again, thank you, David, for the different philosophical questions, Android hardening advice, and also the value of encrypted calendars. Thank you all for tuning in, asking questions, and maybe learning a few things here and there. We really appreciate all of these, and we appreciate your support for the podcast. And hopefully you learn some things from us, or just get some different perspectives on the way we look at things. If you want to join the next Q&A, you can do so already right now on Patreon. It's already live, so you just go in the description right now, join Patreon, and you'll see the Q&A post there, and you can go ahead and ask whatever question you want. Or you can do the same thing on xmrchat.com. So if you have some Monero, you can literally just log in right now. All it requires is a name. You can put anything you want. a message. You can ask anything you want that's appropriate, and you can put in however much Monero you want, and then you just click submit, and that's literally all you have to do. So those are the two ways that you can join the next Q&A, and we're excited to see next week's questions. So see you guys next week.